Have you ever noticed that when we're following the Lord, very often things don't happen in the timeline that we expect them to? We think things are going to work out in a certain way, in a certain order, and it just doesn't work that way. All of a sudden, God is making you wait, or God is doing something that you're trying to catch up and see where He's leading us. And today we're going to be talking about God's timing. We're going to be in the story of Esther, and we're going to talk about the fact that we can perceive that God's timing is always perfect for you, as it was for Esther. And we're going to see that today when we come right back. Hi, and welcome to Bible Study with Friends, where our goal is to help you get more impact from your Bible study. I'm here with my friend Sherry Mangrum, and this is a real Bible study. This is a Bible study between friends. There's no rehearsal, there's no script. We're just in the Word together in the book of Esther. Now today we're going to try something different. We're going to do two chapters. We're going to do chapter 5 and chapter 6. In the story of Esther, these two chapters really are together. And we're going to see as we go through this that what we perceive, even though God is not mentioned by name, we see that God is at work in a way that controls the narrative, as we would say. So let's get into that together. Now, last week, we left off with the death sentence on the Jews and the fact that Mordecai and Esther were fasting. And Esther realized through Mordecai that she was placed in a very unique position to really have an impact on the future of God's people and her people. And we're going to pick up in chapter 4 today, and we're going to go pretty quickly through this because a lot of it is just narrative of how the story, and I'm going to stop and point out some things as we go. But let's get into this, Sherry. All right. Now, why don't you read verse 1 and verse 2 for us, and we'll get started that way.
Okay. Now it came about on the third day that Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace in front of the king's rooms. And the king was sitting on his royal throne in the throne room, opposite the entrance to the palace. When the king saw Esther, the queen, standing in the court, she obtained favor in his sight, and the king extended to Esther the golden scepter which was in his hand. So Esther came near and touched the top of the scepter. Now,
what we've got here is reading what it actually says compared to a lot of Bible stories. Now, I don't know about you, Sherry, but I've seen depictions of where Esther, when she goes to the king, she rushes into the throne room to seek his favor. And that's not what happens here.
No.
If you notice, the queen comes to his throne room, but stands quietly off to the side until he sees her and says, "Oh, you're standing over there. Come forward." So she is being very respectful here. She's not barging in on him. She's not overplaying her hand. She's being very respectful and approaching him with a lot of honor and respect for the position, right?
Yes.
Because the law was you don't come into the king's presence unless he asks you and he extends that scepter as a way of protection. Otherwise, it's a death sentence.
And I looked up the scepter, what was the meaning of it, and it just said it was a symbol of authority.
It was his, and Caesar had one. A lot of kings had scepters as this symbol of their authority. And this is the way he gave permission for people to come, by offering his scepter, and they touched it. And that's what Esther does. So Esther comes very respectfully, and we need to watch these stories that we don't go by our Sunday school stories. We go by what the Bible actually says. And it says, she comes but stands quietly to the side until he sees her. And it's interesting, it uses the word here that he looks upon her with favor. And if you go over to chapter 2, verse 17, you see that same phrase. Look at 2:17. This is when she first comes to be queen.
The king loved Esther more than all the women, and she found favor and kindness with him more than all the virgins. So he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti.
So we talked about this in chapter 2, but he had genuine feelings for her, had genuine favor towards her out of love. And here he says that same phrase again. He sees her standing off at a respectful distance, and she has favor in his eyes, and he offers her the scepter and says, basically permission, come on in and tell me what is on your mind. So now we go back. Verse 3 says, then the king said to her, what is troubling you, Queen Esther? And what is your request? Even to half of the kingdom, it will be done. This is a colloquialism that is used in those days, that even when David was going to face Goliath, and the promise was anybody that killed Goliath would get half of the kingdom. That may not be 50%, but it was this idea of you're going to get a lot of stuff from the king, right? Verse 4, Esther said, if it pleases the king, may the king and Haman come this day to the banquet that I have prepared for him. Then the king said, bring Haman quickly that we may do as Esther desires. So the king and Haman came to the banquet which Esther had prepared. Now, this is the first of 2 banquets. So the first thing, he says, what do you need? What do you want? What's troubling you? And she says, I prepared a banquet. Now, Sherry, why do you think she didn't just right there, he said, I'll give you up to half my kingdom. Why didn't she right then and there say, there's a death sentence on my people that you put? Why do you think she didn't? Why do you think the thing with the banquet?
It feels like a respect thing almost.
Okay, so it's not just coming with the gimmies. It's coming with first I'm going to give you something. Now, what's the old adage of the best way to a man? How about through his stomach? Yeah.
Through his stomach, sorry. And then he did to his heart through his stomach.
She already had his heart.
Yes.
But I think there's 2 reasons for this. One was she knows that I'm going to have a hard ask here, and I'm going to literally butter up in the banquet. Yeah. I'm going to butter up Ashereth. But the other reason I think is interesting is she invites Haman to the banquet, and I think that's to see the interplay between Ahasuerus and Haman. How close are they? What's the relationship like there? And the best way to do that is I'm going to sit over lunch and watch this. So she has this plan to have a banquet. So the king said, hey, bring Haman. And as they drank their wine at the banquet, verse 6, the king said to Esther, what is your petition? For it will be granted to you, even to half of the kingdom. He says, now I've eaten and I've had my wine, and now tell me, what is your desire? As I'll give you up to half my kingdom. So Esther replied, my petition and my request is, if I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and do what I request, may the king and Haman come to the banquet which I prepare for them, and tomorrow I will do as the king says. So you read that and you go, what is going on with Esther? Now, is she afraid? Is she hesitant? Is she just maybe, and I don't know about you, Sherry, but I've been in places where I just say, it just doesn't
Yeah.
feel like time yet.
Yeah.
It's just not the right situation. And so you wait. So here she invites them to a second banquet the next day. And the plan is hatched, okay? She's going to
Yeah.
ply them again with another meal, and she's going to see them both react to that meal as we go. Now, Haman was really, in this day, the king didn't usually have private dinners with the queen and somebody else. Now, the queen could come in front of a whole bunch of people and represent her royal duties, but to have an intimate dinner with just the king and one other person was very unusual for the day.
Mhm.
So she invites him again, and we go back and see what happens. Verse 9, then Haman went out that day glad and pleased of heart. Now, I want you to pay attention to that phrase. He was glad and pleased of heart. He was feeling great, right? But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, and that he did not stand as he never did, right? And he did
Right.
not tremble before him, Haman was filled with anger against Mordecai. Now, this is not the first time he's been filled with anger towards Mordecai, but he's been feeling great until he sees Mordecai and he doesn't get the respect that he supposedly deserves. And so
Yeah.
he is filled with this anger. That's one of the themes of this book.
There's the anger.
Is that anger. And Haman controlled himself.
Wow.
However, he went to his house and sent for his friends and his wife Zeresh. Then Haman recounted to them the glory of his riches and the number of his sons. And if you're interested, over in chapter 9, verse 10, it says Haman had 10 sons. So he recounted the number of his sons and every instance where the king had magnified him and how he had promoted him above the princes and servants of the king. Haman also said, even Esther the queen, let no one but me come with the king to the banquet which she had prepared. And tomorrow also I'm invited by her with the king again. Man, I am in Fat City. I'm on the inside circle here.
He thinks a lot of himself, huh?
Yeah, and this is pride. And then he says this, very interestingly, in verse 13, yet all of this does not satisfy me every time I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. Now, Mordecai is called Mordecai the Jew 7 times in the book of Esther as a kind of a title. It's Mordecai the Jew. And every time I see him, all the stuff I have, all the honors I have go away. And then he gets some bad advice from a bunch of yes men.
Oh boy, doesn't he?
Then Zeresh and his wife and all of his friends said, have a gallows built 50 cubits high. Now, a cubit is about 18 inches. So this was 75 feet high. And make it in the morning, ask the king to have Mordecai hanged on that gallows, and then go joyfully. So he felt great. Then he felt great anger. And their advice is, hey, if you want to feel joy again and be pleased again, because it says the advice pleased Haman, so he had the gallows built. Now here we see why the Lord had Esther wait.
Mm-hmm.
Read verse 1 and let's read from verse 1 down to verse 4.
Okay. Esther 6. During that night, the king could not sleep, so he gave an order to bring the book of records, the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. It was found written that Mordecai had reported concerning Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who were doorkeepers, and they had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. The king said, "What honor or dignity has been bestowed on Mordecai for this?" Then the king's servants who attended him said, "Nothing has been done for him." So the king said, "Who is in the court?" Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the king's palace in order to speak to the king about hanging Mordecai on the gallows which he had prepared for him.
Now, I find this very funny, but it also teaches us an important lesson that even when we don't see God at work, God is at work. And that God's timing is always perfect.
Yeah.
She had two opportunities. One was right at the throne, and the other was at the first banquet. And she waited just because she just didn't feel like it was time. So in the morning, and I put down in my notes, it just so happens.
Yeah.
It just so happens the king couldn't sleep. And it just so happens that he said, "I'm going to have somebody read to me, and that'll help me go to sleep." And it just so happens that where they read in the book of Chronicles, and secular historians tell us that these kings had these books of record of people who had served them. And so it just so happens that in this big book, the section that's read to him is the section about Mordecai's service.
This so happens.
It just so happens. And the king goes, "What was done?" He's got a lot on his mind. He's the king, and there's a lot of bureaucracy. And he says, "What did we do for that guy?" And they go, "There was nothing done for that guy." So he goes, "What? We need to do something for him." And I just think this is a place where it shows God's timing is sovereign. It's sovereign over everything.
Yes.
So we go back, and this is where it gets good. So the king says, who's around? And he says, Haman had just entered. And the king's servant said to him, "Behold, Haman is standing in the court." Again, he's standing off to the side, waiting for permission to come. And the king said, "Let him come in." There's the permission. So Haman came in, and the king said to him, "What is to be done for the man whom the king desires to honor?" And Haman said to himself, who else would the king honor but me?
Huh?
That's his pride happening there. So he's really thinking about what he would like. And it's interesting here that Haman doesn't ask for wealth. He doesn't ask, "Oh, there should be a reward of money." What he asks for is what he's craving, and that is respect. So he says, "Oh, if I'm going to get honored, let me get on the king's horse, and let me put on the king's robes, and let me be led by a prince through the streets so that everybody can see and respect me." Remember what he was angry about with Mordecai was Mordecai didn't respect him, didn't bow down. So the thing that Haman asks for is what he would like to receive as far as honors.
And it just so happens.
And it just so happens.
Up until now, it's been like, what, 2-3 years or something. She still hasn't told.
That's right.
She kept this a long time to herself.
Yeah, per Mordecai's instructions, she had not said what her race was. But
and you're talking about going in 2-3 years.
Yeah, that's right. So back to verse 9, Haman is still thinking of, I want to get respect if this is going to happen to me. So then the king said to Haman, "Hey, that's a great idea. Take quickly the robes and the horse as you have said, and do so for Mordecai the Jew. There again, there's that title, Mordecai the Jew, who is sitting at the king's gate. Do not fall short in anything of all that you have said. And Haman's head explodes. I mean,
like on one of those cartoons.
I could just see him going, what? Oh, man. Now, it's interesting here, and I want to ask a question. Why didn't the king remember? How did that trick work back when it happened, when we see Haman manipulate the king? If you go back and read it, Haman doesn't come to the king and say, hey, the Jews are terrible.
No,
He says, there is a people
yes, that's
in the kingdom that doesn't follow your laws, that they are a stubborn people. He doesn't say the Jews. So he gets Ahasuerus to do this proclamation that we're gonna destroy them. And from the king's perspective, it's destroy this rebellious people. It's not destroy the Jews. Haman is the one who then takes that proclamation and turns it into, we're going to take the Jews, because of his hatred for the Jews. And we talked about that in an earlier chapter. But I see here, there's nothing incongruous with the idea that the king said, I'm going to honor Mordecai the Jew, and not put it together that there was a death sentence on the Jews. Because all he knew was there was a death sentence on this rebellious group of people.
He wasn't given no details.
That's right. So here again, we see God's timing, and this is Mordecai the Jew who's going to be honored. 11 says basically he did everything. He leads Mordecai, led him on horseback through the city square, and proclaimed before him, thus it shall be done. Then Mordecai returned to the king's gate. But Haman hurried home. And now what was his attitude? What was his attitude when he got done with the first banquet?
Oh, he was
joyful.
Yeah, he was all excited and
now he's going
proud of himself
in mourning with his head covered. And Haman recounted to Zeresh, his wife, and all his friends, everything that had happened to them. Then his wise men and his wife said to him, if Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish origin, you will not overcome him, but will surely fall before him. In other words, if the king finds out that Mordecai the Jew is of the Jewish origin that he has ordered through Haman's manipulation, it's curtains for you, Haman. And while they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and hastily brought Haman to the banquet which Esther had prepared. This is the second banquet. So we see in these two chapters, the story moves very quickly. Underlying the story is God knows exactly what he's doing. And God's timing is always perfect. That if she would have asked the request too early, the king may not have put together that the Jews were part of Mordecai's heritage. But as soon as he read Mordecai the Jew was a good citizen and did this for me, and now I'm going to honor Mordecai the Jew, and Haman was between a rock and a hard place. Because the command to kill the Jews was still in effect. This was still in effect. Esther has still a job to do, and we're going to pick that up in the next chapter and see how God continues to work things out coincidentally. It just so happens. Now, stuff has happened with me, and I go, wow, that was a good coincidence. It just so happened to have taken place. So many things in my life God has done, and my perception is, it just so happened that happened. Instead of saying, hey, the Lord's timing is perfect, and I'll surrender continually to the Lord's timing in my life.
And don't you just love 13 where his wife totally flips on him and is Mordecai, the Jew? And this is interesting. You will not overcome him. That's
right.
a very interesting statement.
If Mordecai the Jew, if his origin is the Jews, which it is, and the king realizes the proclamation that you have made in his name against the Jews, you're dead meat.
Yep.
That's
You will
basically
not
what she's
overcome.
saying. And he's between a rock and a hard place and wondering what in the world to do. But he's saying, yeah, but I still get to have an intimate dinner with the king and the queen. And that's going to be good.
Yes.
So then we get into chapter 7 next week and see this story come to a head. Literally, Haman's head. Sorry, I couldn't resist.
Spoiler alert.
We'll do that next week. Talk to you later. Well, we've been talking about God's timing and how there's really no such thing as coincidence for those that have turned their lives over to the Lord for his direction and his guidance. God works things out in the time and in the way that he wills, so that, number one, he gets the glory. Number two, we can't take any credit. We've seen that today in this story of Esther, Mordecai, and Haman. And we've seen that start to unfold. And I want to make a recommendation to you. It's called Open Doors, Free Will, and God's Sovereignty. It's a series on determining God's will, and I think you'll enjoy it. And we're going to continue our story, this fantastic story in Esther, next week. And until then, God bless you.